Thanks everybody for joining. I really appreciate it. And for everyone jumping out with our webinar today, joined by with Ben Godard, head of security at Spotnana. My name's Alex Bovee. And we're going to be talking today. I guess, Ben, technically, you're going to really be talking about closing the door on group sprawl. And excited to share that with everyone who joined today. Quick intro to myself. Again, my name is Alex Bovee. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Conductor One. We're a modern identity governance platform built for IT and security teams to help them secure access identity across their organization. And Ben.
I'm Ben Godard. Thanks, Alex. I appreciate this opportunity to speak. I'm the head of security at Spotnana. Before that, I worked at UiPath and Microsoft and the NSA. I'm really passionate about identity and access, a lot of experience on both offensive and defensive and building tools, and really excited about Conductor One when I found out about it and found like-minded individuals in that company. And, I'm glad that this worked out, that we could talk about something I feel so strongly about and that Conductor One can help make better.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. And then for today's agenda, so we'll be covering a few things. So Ben's got some slides. We'll talk a little bit about the problem using groups for access control, some of the challenges that are inherent there. And I think, Ben, you talk a lot about this in the context of your work at Spotnana. And then you've also been pretty successful, obviously, at shrinking that sprawl. And so I think you're going to jump in and talk to the listeners on some of the strategies and the work there. We'll do a little bit of a demo, which I'm excited to see. It's kind of cool to see other people's products and maybe our own product as well on the demo. And then we've got time at the end for Q&A from anybody on the call. So I want to say we've got 10 minutes or something like that. So if you do have questions, just go ahead and put them. I'm assuming I'm saying this correctly. Put them in the chat. And one of our facilitators is on the call, and she'll be aggregating questions and then teeing them up to us at the end. So happy to catch those. And then as we jump into the presentation, I think to set a little bit of context, this talk is super interesting because I think my background is in identity. I was at Okta for about 5 years previously. And one thing, when you talk to a lot of IT and security teams, everyone really struggles with this group sprawl problem. And there's so many challenges associated with it. You kind of, like, a group is a kind of hammer into a hammer everything, or to a hammer everything looks like a nail. I did get that right. And so you end up with these challenges where you have companies that have, like one of our customers literally has 50,000 groups with 5,000 employees. And just to kind of emphasize a little bit, the challenges there, you at some point get so many groups that you don't know what they do. People have a hard time deleting them. Groups are also powerful because they typically drive authorization. So you have a lot of IT and security challenges, both from an administrative perspective, but also it can be, from a security standpoint, one of the ways that people get access, and frankly, too much access. And so I think groups are just they're unfortunately not the sexiest of topic always, but I do think they are one of the most important things to get right, rationalize, and secure from an enterprise IT and security standpoint. Ben, I'm super excited to hear what y'all are doing at Spotnana here. So without further ado, I'll let you take it over.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. Yeah. I remember when I first started attacking things back in the day, I kept thinking that it was going to be so, sexy, like 0 days and like the movie Sneakers and, the Matrix and all that stuff. And then to find out that most of it is literally attacking identity providers, groups, and over permission accounts and, nested groups and all that stuff was both enlightening and kind of depressing, but it actually made me really successful for a long time. It's the reason why attackers keep doing this day in and day out. So it's nice, to get to know like-minded people who are trying to solve it with products that really fit that niche of, hey, how do we make it easier for people to manage their permissions, but also make it so that attackers don't have an easier way in. So
before you got into security, you thought you were going to be on Sneakers, like with the or hackers when chasing the white rabbit.
I think hackers was a little before I never saw that until much later, but I was a big fan of Sneakers, like the Robert Redford.
Yeah, that's cool.
Say that?
Yeah,
I think it predates it, but ironically, I had different parents, we'll say. So yeah, when we start talking about identity access management, I think it's important to align on what I like to call the language of access. It's what are the core things that we're talking about? What are the universal components across all IAM identity systems? So those are basically the who, the what, and the where. The who is the account, right? That can be the user, the service principal, sometimes it's applications, but it's really that person, that thing, that identity that's you're giving the access to. And then the what is the entitlement, right? It's the permissions, the rights. I think Conductor One uses entitlement. I think that's a great name for just kind of this, whether it's membership or access permissions or whatever. And then the resource is the what. What are you actually granting that principal or that user identity access to? These I like to call the doors, and the entitlements are kind of like the keys, to use that whole analogy of trying to secure your doors, trying to secure, which keys have access to those doors. Everything else, like roles, attributes, groups, etc., these are just abstractions that make access management easier. But at the core level, right, at the lowest level, all those things are really just granting access to this who, what, and where. One side effect of this is that it's easy to lose sight of these core pieces, and there might be some confusion about what permissions or entitlements we're even talking about. I want to focus specifically on groups as a particularly dual-edged abstraction because they're great for granting the same kind of access to more than one person. For instance, if I've got 10 different permissions I need to add for everyone in the engineering team, that could be a big pain because I got to add those same permissions to every person. I got to make sure they're the same. If I forget one of those permissions, 2 people on the team are going to be asking why their access is different and why things look different. But I can add those same 10 permissions to a group. Then I can just add everyone from the engineering team to that group. And if the same group of people need the same access on multiple resources, then adding the permissions to the group instead of each individual is much simpler. Problem is when you try to take those permissions back, or when the permissions each member of the group has starts to drift. What if we no longer want everyone in the engineering team to have the same access? What if we need engineering leads to have different access? Or what if we have engineering managers? And is there, just because you're an engineering manager doesn't mean you no longer should be on the engineering team. Groups are great for composability, and I can be a member of many overlapping groups, but mapping that to a permission can start creating serious problems. So here's an example of where things can start going bad. This is just a screen captured Bloodhound. This is on Creative Commons, so I don't even know if it's a real person's environment, so I'm not disclosing anything that I know of. This is basically just a tool to map all the permissions, to enumerate all the groups and membership. There's a lot of tools like that. We've used similar tools and scripts to enumerate group membership in different environments, in different organizations that I was a part of. But this illustrates the big disconnect between how attackers and defenders view groups. Defenders have to look at this and decide, how am I going to manage this? You've got this tangled web of interconnected memberships. And if you tease one piece apart, what are the cascading effects of that? Whereas for an attacker, they don't care how complex the graph is. In fact, in many cases, the more complex, the better, because there's a better chance that there's going to be an inherited membership that's being overlooked that grants sensitive permissions to a resource that they're going after. And as long as they can just get access to one user that has any of the groups that ultimately grants admin access to that resource, and even better if it was overlooked or nested several layers down, then mission accomplished. Groups also invite sprawl because, as Alex pointed in his blog post, I think it was a year or two ago, he said it's easier to create a new group than to figure out if there's already a group that works for the access that you're trying to grant. Cleaning up groups is a real pain, especially when you don't know who started it, you don't really know what needs that group is providing. It's not always clear what access it's being granted and all that. So where are the doors? Group sprawl helps you lose sight of where are your doors. The more you abstract away the details around the who, what, and where, the harder it is to tell what resources you're granting access to. There's no longer a clear correlation between the group and the permissions. And if you add additional layers of abstraction like roles or permission sets, such as in applications like AWS, it just compounds the problem. Are all dev leads admins? What is an admin in AWS anyway? What permission does that grant? I know that sounds stupid on the surface because, there are admin roles in AWS, but I've literally seen permission sets labeled read-only access, but then when you dive into it, you realize it's granting both the read-only access and the view-only access, which in AWS are two totally different things. One will leak PII data and others will not. And I've seen other permission sets attempting to grant admin access. And so they have the admin role, but then they explicitly go to a bunch of other services and add additional permissions, which is completely superfluous and redundant, which makes it also really hard to understand what is the point of that group, which permission can I now remove, that kind of thing. And then start adding on top of that all similar type of groups that have overlapping permissions or even identical permissions on the same resources, and it gets really complex. In our ideal situation, we would make groups mean something again, and any abstraction like groups and roles would not obfuscate what permissions they're actually granted. So that's what we're trying to show here. It's what is the dev lead? What ultimately do we care about? It's those applications like AWS, Datadog, GitLabs, that kind of stuff. So then the next question is, what are the right keys? Another big problem that groups create is we start bundling our permissions or keys together. Imagine if the only way that I could give my 9-year-old house key was if I gave him my entire keychain, including all the keys to our cars and our safe, all that kind of stuff. That goes back to the original issue that I addressed at the start. It's really easy to start adding permissions to groups and bundling them together. It's really hard to extricate those things because you don't know who grabbed that key ring, right? Or grabbed that access into that group. And maybe they needed all those permissions and maybe they only needed a subset. And so now you have to basically try to decouple all of that. Not only is it difficult to decouple permissions from groups once they've been added, what if I just need to remove a specific permission from one user in that group? If I remove that user from the group, what other permissions will they lose? This happens a lot when maybe we think there's a compromise in a specific app or a specific user account in that app. So we might want to lock someone, or maybe we're just investigating something. And so we want to isolate someone from an app. We don't want to kick them out of email and Slack and all that other stuff. And this also adds to our problem of user access reviews and cleaning up unnecessary access. We also can't just grant just-in-time access, which really is the holy grail when it comes to access control. I'll talk more about that in a sec. But if permissions for a resource are added to multiple groups and a user has access to multiple groups, how do I remove the permission from that user? To use the AWS example again, if I have two permission sets and one is called read-only, but it has both read-only and view-only permissions, and a view-only permission set that only has view-only, and I need to remove view-only, you would logically think I just got to remove that guy from the view-only permission set. But because I don't know that that other permission set that's labeled read-only also has other permissions, I might think I've kicked the person out or removed that access, and they still have access from one of these other groups. And that's just a simple example. I've seen this where people have admin rights 5 different ways, that kind of stuff. I can't tell you how many times in previous engagements, the blue team had thought they had kicked us out because they'd say, oh, they have admin access. Let's remove from the group that gives them admin access. But there's 3 or 4 other ways that we still have it that they had no idea because it's a nested group and people forgot about what that group was even for. So then the other issue is who owns which keys? By using groups, it doesn't allow us to keep ownership of this access, these keys in the hands of the people with the most context. If your groups are being managed by your identity provider, which most of the time they are, by and large, IT is the one who's managing that identity provider. And there's no way IT is going to know the context of everyone in the entire company of who should have what access. That's why most of the time they go with tickets. But even then, it's quite a big ask and a responsibility when you're asking IT to grant standing access to a resource. And a lot of times it's highly privileged, like giving someone admin access to AWS as another example, as the same example. Ideally, if you can grant specific permissions to individuals and the people with the most context, basically the resource owners, can be in charge of that decision, it makes that decision easier, especially when you couple that with just in time. If you can scope the access specifically to, hey, maybe I'm not granting you a group, right, that gives you admin access to 3 or 4 different apps. I can say, hey, do you just need admin access to this specific app or this permission, this group or repo, and you only need it for an hour? Well, now there's a lot less risk, right? I don't have to worry about what you're going to do over the next lifetime of that access. And not to mention, we have logging in a really good system. When you're doing JET, you have a log of who granted that access, and you can ask them the next, after, hey, did you get the thing done that you needed to? If that's an attacker, now you've got accountability, and it makes it much harder to kind of hide and, not make it obvious that you have that access. Approval workflows become more about accountability and visibility. I like to compare this to the example of needing 2 keys to fire a nuclear weapon like in a submarine. It's less about validating that right now is an appropriate time to fire off a missile, and it's more about having to have someone else complicit in that act. So for attackers, it's the same kind of thing. Instead of me just having to compromise one account that just happens to have admin access for the entire environment, even if I compromise, the head of IT or the guy who's on call, he may not have current access to the things I care about. So that requires me to compromise another account to be complicit to enable that. And now, oh, by the way, it's also being logged, and hopefully you've got alerts, going on in Slack or other things saying, hey, by the way, did you do X, Y, and Z with your account when you had access for this last hour? And now there's a lot more people that can be start asking questions and saying, wait a minute, I don't remember doing that. I never asked for this. And then the person approving it saying, I don't remember approving this. And so now you have this visibility and this accountability that attackers don't like, because they want to be able to operate for as long as possible without being discovered. And now all of a sudden people are asking questions.
Ben, I think that's something, the centralized IT command and control, I think I just want to emphasize that, like how much of an underappreciated kind of attack surface area that is, where IT many times has the keys to the kingdom. They can make people super admins in Okta. They might, you might have tier 1, tier 2 support people with like lots of access across lots of different systems to be able to grant privileges and permissions. And so I do just think it's super interesting that we don't talk enough about that from a privilege management perspective, that you've got people who have privileged access in systems that can grant tons of access in other systems. So if you get access to one of those single accounts, or you're able to, confuse the IT team or social engineer them to approve something, or grant access for something, that's just a major problem. I don't want to stop it. I think that's just such
you pointed that out. Honestly, I think it really turned the corner for us when I was on the red team at Microsoft, and we were trying to tell everyone the right way to do things. And then we were like, wait a minute, we've got AWS. Actually, we've got Azure resources that we're using to run our tools. We've got sensitive, build systems and stuff like that, because we were writing our own software. So we were like, we got to eat our own dog food, right? And so we can't be admin access in our own environment. Everything needs an approval. And when we realized how quick and easy that could be, and the fact that it was less about us needing to validate, because it's not like a pull request, right? It's not like saying, hey, are you really supposed to be doing this? It was literally, you didn't ask any questions. You just needed that extra person. And then now you have that log and that accountability to say, we know that something went down last night. We know so-and-so needed access because he called up so-and-so and that person was on call and they approved it. And so you have this kind of audit trail. And that's the thing that's never going to go away, because at the end of the day, if you have an insider threat, they're going to do all the right things, right? Yeah. They're going to have the access they need. They're even going to go through JIT. But the point is, by knowing someone else in that team knows that person had that access, all of a sudden now there's that window saying, hey, something just went down last night or within the last 12 hours. Who had access? Oh, that was you. Hey, what were you doing?
Yeah, right.
It's a vulnerability that honestly, if you're doing the right thing, no one really cares about that, because everyone's like, yeah, obviously you needed that to reset so-and-so's password. But it's when you're not doing that, or you're an attacker, that's when it's not great. And I love those kinds of situations where it's not a big pain for the user, or it even improves the user's experience, but it makes it much worse for the attacker. And I feel like JIT is that, because in many ways, even just getting JIT or even just getting standing access took a lot longer, because the IT guys would have to make sure, like I was saying before, you got to have a ticket. They got to validate, like, hey, did your manager say this is okay? And what team are you really on? And all that stuff. And then they also got to like double check and say, wait a minute, does that guy still need that access? Let's remove it. Whereas with JIT, it's hard, you don't even break a sweat, because you're like, hey, it's only for an hour. Everything checks out through the normal approval process. His manager will get an alert. I'll be able to follow up on the logs later. So there's, it is better for the user because they don't have to wait.
Makes sense.
So yeah, to summarize, we need to do a couple of groups from access rights and get back to the core of what we really care about. Looking at groups, trying to manage these massive groups wasn't helping us figure out, actually manage our identity access system, which is what we really needed. And then we needed to enable users to get access to the entitlements they actually need. And we needed to establish clear ownership and shared responsibility to basically free up IT from having to do all of this enablement that really they didn't have the context for, but then also be able to unblock people and get to as much of a self-service environment as we could. So I've got a demo now that I like to show. Hopefully it all works out and my mouse doesn't die.
You got it all ready to go. Awesome.
Yeah, that's cool.
If you need me to fill dead air, I'll sit here and talk about Conductor One all day long. But we have,
No, you can if you want to.
yeah.
Filling your audiences with Conductor One.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's actually a great. I mean, I'll give a quick 2-second intro to Conductor One because it looks like we're going to be in the demo. So that's great. But yeah, Conductor One, we're a modern identity governance solution. So we help with things like just-in-time access. We help with access control, automation, onboarding, offboarding, permission management across the board. And for small to mid to low enterprise size companies. And we do that across all your different tools and technologies, whether that's AWS, like, Ben was talking a little bit about there, to get up some more of your infrastructure tools, your directories, your cloud, SaaS, native solutions. Doesn't really matter. We will kind of integrate and talk to any of your technology and help you orchestrate identity and access control across it.
Yeah, that's actually the thing that I liked most about Conductor One when we were evaluating different options is just the flexibility, because there's a lot of integrations already built in. There's a lot of discovery that just works, but then they have this whole baton connector system. So like our own internal app, or not our internal, it's the thing we sell to our customers, right? The Spotnana app. We were able to build just-in-time just-in-time access control into that because we could connect with their whole connector setup, baton stuff, which is really cool. No one else can give us that right now because we're not on their radar. It's not like one of the integrations that's going to come built in. They would most of the time force us to work through groups that hopefully are being synced through Skim to our app, which really is not how we were using it. So this is the application view. So honestly, most people who they interact with Conductor One in our company, it's really through Slack. They don't normally see this. This is for managing stuff. So we basically onboarded our identity provider. It pulled in all the SSO apps that were already connected. And then for certain apps like AWS, we could add a specific connector that's built into Conductor One to connect directly to the application and sync at its closer level, right? Because at the identity provider level, it really just knows about that SSO credential, right? That SSO connection to the app. By connecting it with what they call a connector, then it can enumerate everything like, well, I'll show you. So in AWS, this is a great example because there's a lot of things. We call them, or in Conductor One, they call them resources. So you've got everything basically the connector can query from AWS. So we've got accounts, groups, IAM roles, SSO groups. The thing we care most about, and that's the other cool thing, is Conductor One lets you decide what you actually want to manage. So this is my favorite view because it shows these entitlements, which are basically permission sets in AWS that you can see are common across many of the accounts. So this is our entire AWS org. And it's a better way to filter that out. As you can see, we got like 15 or 16 AWS accounts, multiply that by over 10 different entitlements. It gets pretty unwieldy pretty quick. So the example I want to show is this account. There's a lot of our networking stuff in it. It's infrastructure prod networking. So I could click into that. Now these have all the different entitlements that we can grant. Some of these are legacy ones that we were trying to get rid of. In fact, I think you can find the read-only one I was telling you about that we got to clean up. We started creating permission sets that just matched the default roles that were inside of AWS already. And we're trying to get rid of creating these custom roles as much as possible, because one of the things we decided is if we're granting people access for a smaller amount of time and we can monitor everything they did in that window, it's less important that we scope out something that's just the 3 things the person needs to do in this one situation for that one resource, because we don't have to give it to them for a really long time. And if you've ever played that game too, one of the problems is the person can't do what they need to do. So we got to go back and curate either a new custom role or modify the existing custom role. And now you're messing with everyone who already had that access, and it just becomes a pain. So we've tried to align, and that's anything that starts with AWS means we've literally just created a permission set and grabbed something in AWS that already has like a role defined for it, like a built-in managed role through AWS. This is administrator access, read-only access, that kind of thing. So in read-only access, and the other cool thing about this too is originally we were connecting through Skim, through our identity provider, which is JumpCloud, to AWS. And so we were using groups, and Conductor One helped, but it just basically helped us manage membership in groups in JumpCloud that eventually would get synced to AWS. And we could be very specific about those groups and say this is a specific permission set in AWS, but it still creates a lot of groups that are really only for one thing, and it basically pollutes our entire environment with all these groups for every application. So the new connector came out for AWS that lets us provision individual users directly to permission sets. So we can literally throw away groups both in AWS and in Jump Cloud, which is really cool. Because
I wanted to, that one in particular, is something I love talking about, because if you back on your resources view where you see all your different accounts and then permission sets in each of those, the least privilege model says a group per account and kind of permission set coupling, which means if you've got 100 accounts and you've got, 20 permission sets in each of those, whatever, 20 times 100, 2,000 groups,
Yep.
or something like that. So it really becomes like unnaturally, it becomes like an unnatural act to even be able to manage least privilege access via groups. And so you kind of just give up and you over permission, or you let things get messy. So
Yeah. And that's literally, in fact, instead of 2,000 groups, we ended up having groups that would give you the same permission across every account, which was also a pain, because we're like, wait a minute, I don't want to give that to you for the security account if all you ever really do is the dev account, that kind of thing.
It's like the opposite. It's like most privilege.
Yeah. It's or the least pain, which is in the typical model is not least privilege. And that's straight up this just in time. Least privilege can literally be the least pain sometimes, because that's the other thing, is people don't know what to ask for. They know the permission they want in AWS, but now they have to translate that into like, okay, is that dev leads, or is that, product owners, or is that security engineer gurus, like whatever that is. And they don't have to worry about that now. They can just say, I need this. And then it's great for accountability, because we can just scan through, and instead of just looking at a bunch of group memberships, we can literally through Conductor One say, I know exactly which permissions that you have, when you had it, and how long you had it, that kind of stuff. When you set this up, so we've got the entitlement, this is the thing people can ask for and get granted. And the way they get it approved is what we call a request policy. And what's Conductor One will let you create custom policies like, hey, this is everyone in security can approve it, or this is your manager that can approve it, or this is Bob in accounting who can approve it. What we wanted to do, just to also limit request policy sprawl, is to try to create as few approval policies as possible. And so one of those actually comes built into Conductor One, which is this entitlement owner approval policy, which basically, it's as simple as it gets. Basically, it will look up the entitlement and say, who is the owner? And then that's the person who gets to approve it. And so if we go back, what's great about that is we can literally reuse this policy across all of the permissions in AWS and say, as long as we set owners in the entitlement, those are the people who get to approve it. So for this, it's the security team, because this is a security account that we take care of. And so, yeah, it'll go to all three of us. Any of us can approve it. Same thing. If I want to get admin access to this account, just because I'm an owner doesn't mean I automatically get it. One of my other colleagues has to approve it. And it happens really quickly through Slack. And then the other cool thing is, let's say, we are all located on this side of the hemisphere or this side of the earth, and we've got a bunch of colleagues in India. They may need to get into this for an emergency. Let's say the DevOps team has something going on. They can either try to call us up to get this approved, or we could have them submit the approval. And if no one picks it up, they can flip the switch to say, make this an emergency access request. And then it goes into this whole other approval policy. And if you look at this one, it's a little bit more specific. So this is basically security and PNP. And we have said that you can self-approve. And it's basically a combination of both my team and the PNP team. Now, this can get a little hairy, as you can imagine. So yes, I've defined it in one policy, but how do I make sure that this list is kept up to date? What if someone accidentally deletes this list? What if someone, gets added to the team? What if they leave the team? That kind of thing. So this is actually where groups start to make more sense. I'm going to switch demos real quick. One cool thing about Conductor One is they've got a Terraform provider. Our identity provider doesn't have an official Terraform provider, so an engineer on my team actually wrote one and published it. It's out there in the Terraform providers repo. Anyone can grab it. But basically, we can enumerate membership of a group in JumpCloud, and then find those same user IDs inside of Conductor One, and then assign those guys to either a policy or an owners group. So I'm showing this is what the code looks like. It's pretty simple. These are all data objects. So 2 we're pulling specifically from JumpCloud. This is from our provider. Basically, you just give it the name of a group, and then it returns an array if anything matches that. So we just grab the first group in that. So you've got security emergency approvers, PNP emergency approvers. We pull all the members, grab the email as the key, and then up here in the locals, we actually grab Conductor One users for that. So actually, sorry, down here is where we pull the actual Conductor users, and then we just create a set for those 2 groups. So if you see, final period, no, I think I have it down in the policy, but you can see basically, so we create this and then we send it to, this is the actual, actually, no, I think this is a wrapper module in front of the Conductor One resource, but it's basically, we can just concat those 2 groups together and say, those are the user IDs for user approval. This one, I think this is actually showing where it's, oh yeah. And so we can do the same thing for owners. So that was for the policy, but I can do the same thing for the owners. I can give it a JumpCloud group. It can enumerate the members. It can pull out all the Conductor One users matching by their email, and then use that group to then assign to we have a couple of modules wrapping this to make it easier to manage, but ultimately we set it to owner IDs. This is where you can see where we're actually doing the Conductor One resource and setting it. It's that simple. And then it ends up looking like this. So we can basically stamp out a certain pattern for like every AWS account. We have an admin entitlement, a read-only entitlement, a view-only entitlement. We can create custom entitlements. The idea is that it's looking for that emergency grant policy ID. It's also looking for the JumpCloud owner group name that has all the members that we want to just add automatically into Conductor One. And so it gets really, simple at the end where we can just say, hey, that's the name of the group in JumpCloud. Naming's not great. I prefer to get this closer to a name that actually describes what it is. Like, hey, this is the approvers or the owners of AWS resources. PNP did a good job of that. We are a small security team, so it's still pretty much basically anyone who does engineering and security, their birthright access. But we only have to do that right now. Sorry. Okay. This is only necessary right now because Conductor One currently doesn't allow groups for owners, but they're adding that. And when they do, it'll be glorious. And I won't actually even need that Terraform to sync JumpCloud to Conductor One. And then also for like this one, where we're concatenating multiple groups, Conductor One actually has this thing where they have groups defined just inside of Conductor One that can be used. And we can create like dynamic rules. So we just haven't done it yet because we're honestly in the middle of transitioning identity providers when that feature came out. And so what we're going to do is with Enter ID, we'll have these dynamic groups for the PNP approvers and for the security approvers. And then in Conductor One, we will create a group that just, if you have either of those memberships, you get added into this special approvers group that can then be assigned to this policy. So yeah, let's see. Yeah, I think I covered all the Terraform stuff. Oh, yeah, one other thing. The other good use for groups that we found. So one is those ownership, which is instead of using groups to grant access, we can use groups to approve access by assigning the groups as owners and approvers. And what's cool about that is those are less likely to change and they don't need to be just in time. And there's less stake if you get it wrong, right? Because you're still just the person who's being accountable for it. It's not like you actually have permissions to do bad things in the environment. An attacker could attack you to just do that approval, but once again, it is still logged. And if you're starting to see stuff in Slack, you never approved, and it's saying you approved on such and such a date, the gig's up. So the other cool thing is, as you saw with the AWS stuff, there's a lot of permissions that could be asked for. And instead of just giving everyone in the company all of those things, and Conductor One does a good job of kind of filtering all that stuff out. Like if I'm requesting access, I can say specifically what account or which application I want, and I can either get basic access, which is just that SSO access, or I can get a specific group role or resource, and then we can search and go through here. But one thing we did do is we decided to make it so that no one has any access in AWS. Anyone can ask for just AWS SSO access, and their manager can just approve that. And then that just lets them basically see the AWS tile on their My Apps, so that they can SSO in, but then they have no access. But you actually, let me show that real quick. If we look at AWS, the entitlement I'm talking about is this one. They call it the credential or the access. This is just what you get when like the identity provider says you have access now to this app. But in Conductor 1, we could actually bind this to another resource. So we bound it to this group in Jump Cloud called AWS Access. So even though the user is just asking for AWS access and their manager gets the request and their manager approves that, behind the scenes, it not only gives them access to the SSO ability, but they get moved into this AWS access group. And then in Conductor 1, these used to be called catalogs, now they're access profiles. But we could say the only people who can actually ask for all the other AWS accesses are members of this AWS access group. So they've already gotten SSO entitlement. There's ways we could have bound that to make sure you don't accidentally get granted access to AWS and still not have access to SSO in. But we thought this was a good way to basically use groups to filter and isolate basically what can you actually ask for. Let's make sure you've actually got permission to use the app first. And your manager can be the one who says, hey, yeah, you're allowed to use AWS for all engineers. I know you're going to need this for your job. But then the individual resource owners can then say, okay, now that you've got access to AWS, if you want to ask for admin access, I'm the one who can approve it. So I know that's kind of long-winded, but it's pretty exciting. That covers my demo. And yeah, so lessons learned, get to the right questions. What does the user actually have access to? Extract the access rights from the group chaos. Use groups to establish accountability, not for access control, and win. That's it.
I was muted for a second there. Ben, awesome. I love it. If anyone has any questions, we'll be around for a few minutes. You don't feel like you have to stay around. Oh, there we go. Dimitri, any ETA when assigning by group, assigning by entitlement owners will be available. I assume this is about being able to use groups as like resource owners or entitlement owners. Let me check on that. I want to say it's next quarter, but I'm not 1,000% sure. And Dimitri's going to hold me to it.
So we've been asking for that for a while. So
yeah, I know. There we go. Yes, the Terraform provider update is, I believe, going out this week. So there's a question about, refresh to the Terraform provider. That's something the team's been working on. There's a bunch of new API and Terraform support for, resource creation, linked entitlements, all that kind of good stuff is going to be in there.
Can you search entitlements by name?
That's a good question. I'm actually not 100% sure on that. Any other questions? Anything exciting on the Baton roadmap? Tons of exciting stuff. We've been continuing to add a lot of provisioning capabilities. We're also adding a bunch of new kind of more opinionated connector default types. And so Ben mentioned adding Baton connector for his back office portal, and sort of like what they use for provisioning access for customers. We're going to have more opinionated connector types that don't require you to write any code, but can integrate with applications that are maybe like web, non-API enabled applications, back office applications, and maybe have a database where you don't have to write code. So just lots of things. I think broadly, not only are we adding a bunch of connectors to that ecosystem, the open source ecosystem, but the actual development experience and the kind of and the experience of adding connectors to legacy applications is going to be a lot easier in the next few months. So there's some really exciting stuff coming around that. And then we already support, I just don't know that we've like launched these, but things like ticket provisioning. So Baton connectors can be not only used for provisioning identity and access and permissions and syncing that, but also can be used for, they can implement like a ticketing interface. So we've got that for our Jira and ServiceNow and like those types of systems. So you can use them to create external tickets. But there's a bunch of additional interfaces that are happening on the Baton ecosystem around usage, provisioning, ticket provisioning, and a few other things that are coming that I think tie into our platform super well and are really going to be great extensibility points for customers.
And that does sound exciting. It's pretty cool.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I super appreciate it. Great questions. Ben, thanks for being on, walking through what you guys have done at Spotnana. I think it's super interesting and really powerful. Great story.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.